Chapter 81. You were naturally quite tempted to simply cut the ropes of the bridge before vanishing into the undergrowth, but you swiftly discarded that idea once you realized that a normally well-hidden path through the mostly unexplored woods like this one was quite the good asset to have in case of emergency. Thus, after taking another moment to properly think about the matter, you soberly decided that, yes, adding this path to your assets for contingencies far outweighed whatever value those few false knights currently occupied with guarding the bridge could possibly hold. And while it would be needless to say be far more desirable if you were spared from ever encountering a situation that might force you to make use of this little bridge of theirs, contingency plans weren't exactly crafted to be of use when their creators were having a lot of luck as of late. So while it was a bit disappointing that the valley would need to remain as peaceful as it had been since you found it for the mountain clans to properly maintain the bridge with minimal security, you were sure that you could live with it. Especially seeing as the Vale had many untouched ravines such as this one, as the Errands hadn't been able to spare the resources they would have needed to make use of them. For while the Vale had never been truly stable, the flow of water in the rivers of the lowlands had apparently been quite consistently more than sufficient throughout the last few hundred years. Or so you would guess, as no matter how much you tried to find them, not even a single foundation of the watermills these lands surely once held could be found. You didn't have much time to spare, so the amount of ravines you had been able to actually check was naturally quite limited, but you decided to trust your gut in this matter, as you couldn't imagine that all these outwardly untouched ravines held infrastructure worth saving up. For the more night squads you found and followed, the more secret infrastructure and untouched land you were able to mark on your map before you decided to return to your companion the moment you spotted the first group of unarmored clansmen in the distance. You would return with your companion once he accomplished whatever goal he was trying to achieve to make sure that all the remaining mountain knights you could reasonably get your hands on and the secrets they were exposing would be dealt with. For the simple fact that both you and your companion were faster than the average clansman remained unused, and the ability to retain the initiative even if you were to start retreating wasn't something you could just leave in the dirt. Especially considering that the mountain clans wouldn't be able to afford the massive loss of their camp and elites for nothing in return with how their army had been structured, which would most certainly make sure that you couldn't let them focus on hunting you and your companion down alone. Your companion for his part had apparently just continued his grisly and disturbing work as if you had been gone for no longer than 2 or 3 minutes, leaving only his soon-to-be-dead opponents and the corpses of the slain to tell what had truly transpired while you had been occupied. And the tale said corpses told you was quite bothersome, as most of the men turned fertilizer hadn't been clad in steel like the mountain knights that had fallen to defend the gate, which meant that you had quite clearly run out of time. But that being said, the monster you called your companion surprisingly didn't seem all that bothered by the fact, nor did it feel like things were going amiss as you watched your companion continue his slaughter from your nearby hiding spot in the bushes. If you hadn't already figured out that your giant companion wasn't actually human, you were sure that now would be the point where even the densest of minds would get the message that the knight in his blackened armor, now broken and pierced in a dozen places, simply couldn't be considered mortal. You hadn't really understood that the difference between your expectations and reality had been as massive as they currently seemed, but a revelation like this should have been so obvious that even the greatest of fools should have seen the flaw in genuinely fighting something immortal. You supposed that even people with a decent head on their shoulders like the enemy commanders could fool themselves if a situation this grim turned out to be hopeless from the start if they wagered as many lives as they had. It was only natural that the guilt of losing the best the mountain clans could muster for this generation on something that turned out to be completely out of reach would mess with the thoughts of everyone that had truly invested their heart and soul into the struggle against the Errands. And the more you thought about their situation, the more understandable it became that they weren't able to think clearly. It actually humanized them a great deal despite how little sympathy you could find for them within yourself after the warriors of their fellow clans had tried to kill you again and again. Thus, you simply watched and waited just far enough away that you couldn't make out your companion's favorite way of abusing the empathy of humanity against itself, for while you could see that the clansmen had adapted, you still had no interest in getting any closer to that hell than you absolutely had to. For simply mercy killing whoever fell fatally near your companion wasn't exactly a perfect solution no matter how much you stretched it, and you were pretty sure that a few still got squished, as you could see that the mass of men still froze up from time to time. Sigh, you couldn't help but wish that your companion would finally revert back to his usual self, but with how much fighting there was to be had you knew that wasn't going to happen. Though, if he really was as immortal as he looked with his untiring attacks and the state of his armor, you supposed that you could risk to speed things up a bit. Chapter 82. Though, a small problem with speeding things up like you wanted still remained, namely the plentiful archers of the mountain clans, who had long since decided to leave your companion to the mountain knights and their reinforcements. You couldn't really underestimate these guys, as they were experienced enough to not pointlessly waste their arrows on him, and you very much so doubted that these currently unoccupied archers would continue to be that frugal once you intervened. For despite all the chaos your companion had been causing, you were pretty sure that the archers would notice the change quite rapidly once the first few vials of poison did their work, and that wasn't the kind of risk you were willing to take. But that being said, it wasn't like the problem was severe enough to actually dissuade you from trying to add some more value to your name, as you were naturally quite confident in your ability to trick the archers with all the little assets you had at your disposal. Thus, after reassuring yourself that your companion would be fine even if you contributed nothing, you backtracked deeper into the woods to scavenge the equipment of one of the female scouts you had managed to neutralize not that long ago. It took you a few minutes to find and patch up the damage you had inflicted upon it by driving one of your daggers through the girl's back, but once you finished, a third of your work was pretty much done. The next two steps naturally being the drawing of a second map minus the locations you had still some use for, and of course the infiltration of the camp itself. So that was what you did as you returned to your hiding spot in full disguise, as there was no reason to draw the new map near the great tree you had decided to hide the two dead scouts under. You couldn't help but get a bit giddy as you thought about just how rare such an opportunity was, as ignoring the strength of your companion even the best knights of the king could only take on a few dozen enemies at most as far as you knew. And seeing as most of the poisons you had used at Studley Castle had been lighter than air, the remainder of your supplies should reap quite the tally. Especially since the densely packed formation of the clansmen should make more than sure that the poisons will resist the winds and stay exactly where you would be throwing them. All things considered, you might just end up with the greatest kill count in a single engagement a human could possibly get away with if you separate assets like dragons and whatever kind of spirit your companion was from your poisons. There was of course still the possibility that your companion would feel a little annoyed at being denied some of his disturbing fun. But there was simply no way that you would still be expendable after you put the lethality of the best knights the realm has to offer to shame, and you were decently sure that your companion could prioritize whatever mission he was on over having fun. With these thoughts in mind and your map finally finished, you swiftly made your way to the gate in hopes that you wouldn't need to listen to another one of your companion's opponents getting unlucky. For while you were sure that you could trick some brutes without much issue, you still couldn't afford to lose your focus while you talked your way past the remaining guards by the gate, especially seeing as fleeing wasn't really an option with that many archers so close nearby. The delivering of the map to the commanders simply had to go smoothly to get as many troops as possible out of the camp to make sure that you could volunteer for one of the open spots on the walls without raising any eyebrows. And while flinching at the sound your companion found so endearing wouldn't be enough to blow your cover as even the mountain knights still flinched each time, you very much so doubted that you could actually keep up a facade like that. But luckily things had gone relatively smoothly as you had little difficulty passing through the gate and only heard that sound of condensed agony twice shortly before you were allowed to enter the surprisingly massive command tent by a pair of tired-looking guards in plate. Explaining that you had found the map near one of the easternmost locations marked on it had been quite easy, and knowing of the wildlife you had seen not too far away from the location you were describing, you didn't lack details to sell them the story. As a nearby cave of black bears made for the ideal excuse for why the map and its owner had separated without the need for bloodshed or any kind of encounter for that matter. It was accurate enough that every clansman that had experience in the region could probably affirm the truth of your words, while the lack of information on the enemy itself created the hoped-for amount of uncertainty and urgency in them. Thus, you successfully found yourself a nice and cozy spot on one of the small towers overlooking the once more quite busy gate a few minutes later, as you patiently waited for the reinforcements to leave for their isolated outposts within the woods. It was a bit frustrating that your plan depended that much on drawing the last few reserves out of the camp as you knew that more of their reinforcements were still on their way, but there was nothing that could speed that part up. Some things simply needed time and the right setup. There really was very little you could do, as throwing the poison from where you stood was pretty much the only way to make sure that the clansmen wouldn't try to disengage. For there was a difference between sacrificing oneself to take down a strong opponent and dying to the trap of an enemy. And while you didn't know much about the mountain clans, you couldn't imagine that the people could fight as long as they had against the Knights of the Vale without the use of poisons of some sort, as most of the reinforcements you had the chance to observe were still under-equipped. Especially since it normally takes a lot more than just martial prowess to take on a proper knight, and if you don't have any armor and your weapons can only inflict some scratches here and there, it would be a wonder, or extremely atrocious luck if they didn't use poisons from time to time. So there reasonably shouldn't be any reason for the clansmen fighting below to think anything was amiss if they were killed by poison if they thought it was used to take down that monster of a knight they were facing. Even valor could be exploited after all, and seeing as they still hadn't broken even after your companion's darker side had taken him over, there was most certainly no shortage of valor down there. Chapter 83. Yet despite how smoothly things were going, you couldn't really help but be annoyed with yourself for not coming up with this ridiculously simple idea of yours right from the start as you waited for the last squad of their reserves to vanish into the woods. But since their reserves had finally been spent, you supposed that your desire for faster gains might sound a little greedy, all things considered, especially since you had been able to tell just how much your map had carried you while you lied through your teeth before their commanders. Sigh, it seemed like you were still a bit of a perfectionist at heart if you were seriously losing your focus to the mistakes of the past while you were still in mortal danger. Though, as you heard the reaction to your companion's special treatment once more, you found that your mind was still in working order as you managed to swiftly refocus on the present, where you silently drew one of your drugged daggers to take care of your fellow guard. And take care of him you did, as you cut and offered him a few apple slices laced with one of your non-lethal favorites to make sure that the risk remained as manageable as you could make it, since every second of potential warning was one you couldn't afford. For while your confidence in your companion's ability to shrug the poisons off had only grown, there was still a decent chance that you would need to make a hasty retreat if your confidence had been misplaced. It took a few more moments to hide him behind the hatch and to open the wooden front shields of the tower, but once everything was done, you found yourself alone with your loaded sling and the sight of a wide-open field filled with a sea of enticing targets. And the longer you observed it, the more that already quite gruesome sight before you resonated with your soul, as you could feel that this was truly the opportunity of a lifetime while you slowly built up momentum for your first throw. You needed a little longer to properly aim, since it would need to hit your companion straight on to properly sell the illusion to his opponents and to make sure you would still have a way out in case worse came to worst. And so, with everything set up as good as you reasonably could, and every asset at your disposal utilized, you let the first vial fly across the battlefield, where it shattered against your companion's back the moment it made contact. There was a distracting silence shortly after, but with each following vial the tenacity of the struggle picked back up as the men closest to your companion made clear what was happening as they dropped with screams of agony one after another. And while most men would have backed off by now, these clansmen had spent far too much blood to just withdraw, even if your aim was simply abysmal in their eyes, as only 1 out of 5 vials actually hit your gore-covered companion. Though despite being covered in a dozen slowly evaporating poisons, your companion looked unbothered as he kept on swinging like nothing had changed, which for obvious reasons was in equal measure both good and bad. For it meant that the optimal scenario you had imagined might actually come to pass, as it allowed you to throw ever more lethal concoctions onto your companion and your shared enemies without the need to worry about him, which would help you with the creation of the necessary false hope. It was such a weight off your shoulders that you nearly overlooked the equally massive problem of his still missing reaction, which could mean only one thing, namely that he was back in control of himself too soon. And while it was admittedly true that his darker side was a bit too dangerous for your taste, you couldn't help but complain internally how much the adaptability of his darker side could have helped you by playing the part of the poisoned monster for a bit. Or so you thought as you watched how the clansmen below suddenly began charging your companion as they had when he first knocked down a gate who knows how many hours ago. The sight left you confused, as they should have learned what a massive folly that course of action was already, but with all the rapid movement you couldn't get a decent look at your companion through the kicked up dust either, so you just kept on throwing till you suddenly understood why they had like madmen charged through the poison-filled air surrounding him. For despite struggling with the dust and the lack of light thanks to the slowly setting sun, you eventually managed to see that your companion had suddenly begun swinging his giant warhammer with just one arm. and after focusing you finally saw that the top of a broken pipe belonging to one of the deceased mountain knights, going by its apparent sturdiness, had managed to wedge itself between the plates of his upper and lower arm, where his gambesine had finally given in to wear and tear. It was surprisingly good fortune, since the currently dominant part of your companion had no talent for acting, opposed to his sadistic and wolf-like side that enjoyed playing with its victims. But you supposed after a short moment of thought that the true question was if your companion would be able to deal with his impediment, since even such a lethal mix of poisons would still take a few moments to destroy the human body, enough to neutralize whatever brave fool had stepped into it. Their casualties to your poisons already stretched into the hundreds, so the lost speed of your companion wasn't really the end of the world. But since they had managed to incapacitate one of his arms in the time it took for the personality change to finish, you couldn't help but worry. And well, if they managed to immobilize your companion properly, there was no way for you to free him, and neither was there a way for you to gain the recognition for the work you did today. It might be a little bit selfish to think about yourself in the current mess, but so was his insistence to attack this specific host of the mountain clans, was it not? Chapter 84. Well, it still seemed like your companion had things in hand, as the soon-to-be dead men that actually made it through the poison clouds without liquefying their organs attacking him were sent flying just like their predecessors had been when things had first started. And while he was far more unbalanced than he usually was, the changes in his fighting style had done nothing to diminish his oppressing impression in your eyes. For there were few people you knew of that could claim to hold the sheer power required to wield such an imposing warhammer with all their strength, let alone wielding it after hours of battle with but a single hand. You genuinely couldn't understand why your companion was having this much trouble without looking troubled, or why his other side had decided to retire from the fight if he was still holding up as well as it looked from where you stood. It just didn't make any sense. There was of course the possibility that knowing the plan of the Lannisters for the Vale was required to understand why your companion was sent to take care of the mountain clan leaders, and why he decided to do it the way he did. But since more and more reinforcements were still flooding in from the silent darkness of the surrounding woods, you couldn't understand why the Lannisters hadn't sent more of their Black Knights if they had planned for such a battle. If they had enough of these knights to form an honor guard out of them, you couldn't understand why sending 2 or 3 of them into the Vale would have brought any disadvantages, since your companion wasn't exactly the stealthiest of characters considering the bloodbaths you witnessed on your journey. Especially since the rebels and bandits you encountered on your way out of the former lands of the Reach just couldn't be considered a threat requiring their presence no matter how long you thought about it. One of them had been more than enough to force you to withdraw after all. But be that as it may, the facts that your poisons obscured by the increasing darkness as they were continued to take their toll on the enemy while your companion's slaughter picked back up remained, thus you were honestly just annoyed with the lacking speed instead of being disheartened by your thoughts. After all, the both of you had raked up nearly 2,000 enemy casualties, so just short of 200 slain clansmen each passing hour, and that without suffering any losses on your own side. It would take a madman to seriously complain about that kind of cost-to-price ratio. Thus, after exhausting the last remains of your befitting poison supply, you decide to close up the shields of the tower once more before you simply leave the place to the still sleeping archer. For as far as you could see, there was no point in sticking around, as you were obviously quite sure that the poisons and your companion would be able to continue their work without your presence. And besides, there were still thousands of clansmen to deal with, since they had turned out to be nigh endless for all it's worth considering the sheer number of arriving reinforcements. Though there was still a piece of good news to be had, as you overheard that the last of the requested troops would arrive during the night. So even if they decided to send out further requests for reinforcements tomorrow, you were sure that they wouldn't manage to arrive anytime soon. For while the last batches of arriving troops needed only around half a day, there was a massive difference between marching now and marching once the scouts of the errands managed to spot the massive amount of gaps your companion had created by drawing them all towards him. Mayhaps that had all been part of the plan, or perhaps you had simply read too much into it, since the two of you were still outnumbered by a bit over 3,000 to 1 going by the tents that had sprouted up around the camp. But since your companion had never ceased to be a monster on the battlefield even once, there was a decent chance that the plans of the Lannisters had just estimated your companion's strength as always sufficient, no matter how much martial prowess was actually required, since that was quite hard to measure. Yes, you supposed it made some sense that the Lannisters wouldn't really care how much time the two of you required to finish this mission of theirs, as long as things worked out in the long term with how little they had invested. But you were naturally a bit less focused on the long-term success, since you had been quite bothered with the set of clothes that made up your disguise, since it had apparently been created for the cold mountain passes, much to your chagrin. And honestly, you weren't naive enough to believe that life would be kind enough to give you the chance to refresh yourself outside the camp, for while leaving the camp wasn't really an issue as your disguise had been holding up till now, you knew that the effort would just be a risky waste. Simply because the woods were naturally filled with at least 3 times the original number of scouts that had, as far as you knew, continued to search for the traces of their enemies uninterrupted. And seeing as they did so while most escape routes from the region had still a good number of mountain knights guarding them, you couldn't imagine that you would be overlooked even in disguise. So you once more supposed that you had to be satisfied with the fact that you sped up the process while you managed to get a nifty achievement out of it, which was pretty clearly a decent outcome, even if the last stretch turned out to be a bit of a pain. A fact that managed to remind you of the absurdity of your situation as you simply continued to ponder on the matter as you neared the command tent to see if you could speed things up a little further. Though before you could even be questioned by the barely standing guards that quite clearly belonged to the exhausted reinforcements, you were suddenly interrupted as both the tent, the ground, and everything else in the camp turned red in an instant. Chapter 85. To say that you were shocked by the change would have been the understatement of the lifetime, as the up to now quite unusually warm night turned so searingly hot that it felt like you were standing within a wildfire. And considering the lack of sound around you, it swiftly became apparent that you hadn't imagined the change for one reason or another either, as the rest of the camp, including the guards, before you looked up in disbelief. It took you a good moment to readapt, as your training had made sure that sudden changes in your environment wouldn't break your disguise or cover at the cost of your reaction time when you weren't on guard, though you nevertheless managed to join them a moment later. And despite having witnessed all kinds of impossible stuff during your time with your companion, the monster before you still defied comprehension, as the continuously growing and shrinking mass of moving magma that had appeared without a sound behind you just silently dripped half-molten boulders the size of galleys into the camp. Though perhaps it was wrong to call what you witnessed silent, as the impacts of the boulders were anything but, yet despite that fact the camp still felt deathly silent, even as the walls to both your left and right were turned into burning wreckage by the claws of the looming monster above. You had dealt with a lot of both danger and nonsense as of late, but this thing before you was seriously just a bit too much, no matter from where you looked at it. For even the most outrageous of legends you had encountered in your life couldn't attempt to explain what you were looking at, as the mass of sentient magma effortlessly dwarfed the surrounding mountains. Even the few remaining mountain knights that had proven themselves all but immune to fear as they valiantly contained your companion had just dropped their weapons in despair as they took in the 4-kilometer-tall titan of molten stone. Since it was here on the masters of both you and your companion were essentially the only faction you ever encountered that managed to deploy a being that might just clear the threshold of immortality, you supposed that the titan wasn't actually hostile, much to your relief. Though considering its size and power, you very much so doubted that it actually mattered, as every new wave of heat the titan produced as its form expanded and contracted still managed to make you feel lightheaded despite the distance. Yet after considering that the very center of the camp was the only place that hadn't been turned into what could only be described as a hellscape of craters, as only a small spot of the titan's torso was made of solid rock, you were sure you could endure the heat a little longer. Though that being said, after you thought about what had led up to the madness all around you, you couldn't help but scold yourself as it became ever clearer that you really shouldn't have done anything after your companion had turned down your help if he had from the beginning expected such powerful reinforcements. You truly couldn't understand what was going on, as the monster still hadn't attacked once, as the boulders and their massive shockwaves had been more than enough to deal with the amassing hosts of the mountain clans. What's more, you couldn't even understand why the Lannisters needed you to take care of the good Lord Arryn if the thing was large enough to just eat most castles in the realm if it ever got the urge. And while you had known just how deadly the dropping of something heavy from a great height was, as anyone with a bit of common sense naturally did, you couldn't comprehend why this was the way the Titan had chosen to finish them off. For despite how effective the dropping of ship-sized projectiles formed several kilometers high had most assuredly been, It was still a question just how far the mountains could potentially carry the sounds of such tremendous impacts, and naturally what the consequences would end up being. And all of this was seriously beyond you as you looked down and just silently watched how your freed-up companion took care of the last remaining clansmen in the ruins of the camp. And you thanked the gods from the bottom of your heart for the fact that these had been proper hosts and not the usual tribes you and your companion had passed by on your journey through the Vale. It helped you a lot with distancing yourself from all the madness as you found yourself dead tired without any foes around as the danger stemming from the looming monster couldn't really be avoided. Thus, you simply dropped your scout disguise and continued to wait for your companion to finish up as you tried to distract yourself from the notion that you would forever remain the little expendable playing piece of the rock that you were. And while you were admittedly quite curious about what else the Lannisters had been after, you decided that could wait for another day, as your bleeding ears and consequently disheveled mind were really in some need of a good potion and a good night's rest. The coming one-sided exchange could wait for tomorrow. You weren't entirely sure how it had happened, but you soon woke up to the usual sight of your silent companion, both cleaned and well rested, and ignoring the state of his equipment your companion remained annoyingly unchanged. It actually looked like what had happened the night before was by now just a thing of the past for him, but you wouldn't let that matter go just yet, for the absence of the scorchingly radiant Titan simply couldn't be ignored. Though before you could open your mouth to get some answers, your companion already pointed out of the cave entrance he had apparently been guarding, so you swiftly checked over your equipment and joined him in looking down the mountainside. Though you couldn't claim that what you saw below made things any clearer, as the woods of the valley that had once contained the camp of the mountain clans and their reinforcements had been burned down to the ground. And as if to make the destruction before you even more ridiculous, the location that once hosted the elites of the mountain clans had turned into a crater so vast and deep that you couldn't even see the bottom from where you looked, with the Titan still being nowhere to be found. Yet as if to make the situation even harder to understand, the valley had been filled with a new host, though quite confusingly one that didn't just raise the banners of the Errands as would be natural but those of the Starks and Baratheons as well. Yeah, you really wanted some explanation right about now.